Everyone, and now chapter 3 of The Fastest Boy in the World. The bus to Piazza was much smaller than the big red ones that rumble in and out of Kidami. It was packed tight with people already. "It's full," I said, hanging back. But Yusuf gave me a shove in the back, and I shot in through the door almost into the lap of a fat lady with a black scarf tied around her head. My face went hot with embarrassment, but I didn't have time to think about it, because then Yusuf gave grandfather a push, and he almost landed on top of her too. Somehow or other, everyone shuffled up a bit, and grandfather got to sit down properly, with me squashed between him and the fat lady. Then the boy by the door slid it shut with a slam, and we were off. It was awful. I couldn't help leaning on the fat lady, and she kept prodding me with her elbows, muttering with annoyance, and the bus set off with a roar, then lurched about all over the place. Nobody seemed to think there was anything odd about it. I couldn't imagine how people lived like this all the time. I was worried about paying the fare because I had no idea how much money it would cost. I started trying to pull the money pouch out from inside my shirt. Luckily, grandfather knew what to do. He fished some coins out of his pocket and gave them to the boy, who accepted them with a nod. It was stuffy in the bus. I didn't mind the smell of hot people, but the petrol fumes were disgusting, and I thought I was going to be sick. I can't be sick, I told myself. I mustn't be sick. Please don't let me be sick. Just when I thought I'd have to be, the boy by the door called out, "Piazza," and the bus jerked to a stop, and the door slid open, and everyone tumbled out. I'd been dreading this bit. I kept remembering what Abba had said about grandfather being old, and how he hadn't been in Addis Ababa for years, and how I would have to look after him. I can't look after him, I thought, feeling panicky. I can't look after myself. I don't know where we are or where to go. I needn't have worried after all. Grandfather had settled his shawl back round his shoulders, and now he looked ready to set off. "Don't stand there gawping, Solomon," he said. "Come here. What do you expect me to lean on? Thin air?" Then he set off, his hand clamped onto my shoulder, and we pushed our way through the crowds of people. I felt worse than I'd felt all day. My feet hurt, my ears buzzed with the noise of the people and the traffic, and my stomach was still churning after the ride in the bus. "Are we nearly there, grandfather?" I wanted to ask, but I didn't because it would have sounded childish. But then grandfather's hand twisted on my shoulder as he pushed me out of the big crowded street and down a little lane. He stopped. "Is this it?" I said. He didn't answer. And looking up, I saw something I'd never seen before. Grandfather was unsure of himself. He looked smaller all of a sudden and older. We'd stopped outside a corrugated iron fence, and as we stood there, a door in it opened and a man stepped out. He looked about the same age as my father. Grandfather cleared his throat. "Good day," he said, in a voice that sounded almost quavery. "Is this the house of Mr. Wandu?" The man was setting off up the lane, but he stopped and turned. Yes, it was evening already, and the light had almost gone. The man leaned forward to look closely at grandfather. Uncle Demacy, is that you? I felt almost sick. I felt almost weak with relief, and I could tell that grandfather did too. Wandu, my boy, it's you, isn't it? They clasped each other's hands and touched shoulders, right, then left, then right. But even when in dim light, I could see what grandfather couldn't. My father's cousin looked as if he'd had a nasty shock. He looks almost scared of us, I thought. He wishes we hadn't come anyway. Cousin Wandu seemed to pull himself together and managed a weak smile. Come in, uncle, he said, leading us into his compound. Where have you come from? Have you traveled far today? Only from home, grandfather said. We had crossed the little patch of bare earth in front of the house, and now cousin Wandu was opening the door. And how was the journey? I suppose the bus was jam-packed. Did it break down? It always does when I travel out of Adidis. He's laughing at us, I thought. He thinks we're ignorant. What bus? We walked, of course, grandfather said. His sharpness usually scared me, but I was glad to hear it in his voice now. You walked? Wandu sounded astonished. A woman had pushed aside the bead curtain that covered a door at the back of the house. She had a narrow face and a sharp look in her eyes. She started in alarm when she saw us and pushed away the little girl who was holding onto her skirt. Meseret, you remember Uncle Demacy? Said cousin Wandu. It's wonderful to see him after all this time, isn't it? He sounded almost pleading. You're welcome, said cousin Meseret, unwillingly. Who's this? All eyes turned on me. I stood there feeling stupid, a hot flush spreading right through me. He's Solomon, my grandson, grandfather said shortly. He walked all the way from Kidami, too. Cousin Wandu didn't seem able to believe it. Of course he did, said grandfather. It's nothing to a boy his age. When I was 11, and he started on one of his rambling stories. All I could think was, when are they going to give us a drink and something to eat? They did at last, of course. There was a lot of bustling about, and I heard sharp words from cousin Meseret, who was in the kitchen behind the living room. She was telling cousin Wandu what to do. I was a bit shocked, quite honestly. Ma would never have talked to Abba like that. At last, cousin Wandu came out with some bottles of orange soda for us to drink. I was glad I'd had a fizzy drink once at Marco's house, or the bubbles would have given me a real surprise. He looked nervous as he fumbled with the bottle opener. You'll stay here with us, of course, cousin Wandu said, shooting a glance at his wife, who nodded, smiling. Something inside me relaxed. I hadn't realized how worried I'd been about where we were going to sleep that night. Yes, I thought triumphantly, we've made it. We're here. I don't remember much more about that evening because as soon as we'd had supper, and it was a nice one too, with plenty of meat, I felt so sleepy that I could hardly keep my eyes open. I did hear grandfather say, it's only for a couple of nights, Wandu. There's a man I have to see tomorrow. We'll be going home the day after that. And I saw the relief in cousin Wandu's eyes as he said unconvincingly, stay as long as you like, uncle. You know that my house is your house. Chapter 4. Nothing would have kept me awake that night. I think I was asleep before I even laid down on the mat that cousin Wandu had laid out for me on the floor. The rooms in cousin Wandu's house were full of furniture. You had to be careful all the time, not to bump into things. We don't have furniture at home, except for a couple of stools. A squeaking noise and a metal clang woke me up at last. I felt a shock of fright when I opened my eyes. The light was so bright. It poured into this strange room through glass windows. I sat up. Grandfather's bed was empty. The clanging noise must have come from when he'd opened the metal door to go out. I groaned as I stood up. Every bit of me was stiff and my feet felt sore. Cousin Wandu and grandfather were sitting at the table, and grandfather was drinking a glass of tea. The little girl I'd seen the night before was staring at him with her mouth hanging open. She was wearing a pink dress made of frills that stuck out all around her. I wish Conjit could have seen it. Her eyes would have popped right out of her head. Grandfather cleared his throat and the little girl jumped back with fright. "Say good morning to Uncle," Cousin Wandu said in a jolly voice, pushing her forward. She wasn't having any of that. She scuttled off into the room with the big bed in it and slammed the door behind her. "She keeps us all in order," said Cousin Wandu with a smile. I looked at grandfather. I knew he wouldn't approve of that. It was never too early in his view to train children to be respectful. I thought he'd be frowning, but I could see that he'd hardly noticed the little girl. He just looked ill. There was a gray ting to his skin, and his eyes seemed to have sunk deeper into his head. Cousin Wandu had noticed too. "You should rest, Uncle," he said. "Have a quiet day. Leave your business till tomorrow." Grandfather shook his head, as I knew he would. "No need to fuss," he growled. "Nothing wrong with me." He felt under his shawl and pulled out a crumpled paper, folded small. "Look at this, Wandu. Happiness pastry. How do I find it?" Cousin Wandu gave a sort of twitch. He bit his lip and shot a sideways look at Cousin Meseret. She just shrugged and stared back at him blankly. "You want to eat some pastries, Uncle?" he said at last, turning back to us. "But there's no need to run around town. Meseret can go out and buy some for you." He pushed a plate of rolls towards grandfather. "Please have some breakfast. You too, Solomon. Look, there's honey. It's very good. The best." His voice was soothing, as if he was talking to a child. I hated that. But grandfather just waved his hand. He could have been swatting a fly. "If you don't know where it is, Wandu," he said, "I'll find someone who does." I couldn't understand all this business about the happiness pastry. Anyway, I was looking longingly at the plateful of rolls on the table. White bread. I'd hardly ever had that before. I felt too shy to help myself, but grandfather gave me a curt nod. "Eat up, Solomon. We've got to get going." Cousin Wandu had been biting his lip. "Why don't you let me help you, Uncle?" he said, with a bright smile. "I'll go out and find the pastry shop for you. It might be miles away at the other end of Adidas. You'll exhaust yourself wandering about all day. I'll go and find it, and I'll tell you where it is, or better still, take a message for you. If there's someone there you want to see. Something was up with Cousin Wandu. He was trying too hard, I could tell. I knew the look on his face. Marcos looked like that when he was telling his dad that we were going to do our homework together under the tree in the school compound, when really we were just going to kick an old ball around. He doesn't care about grandfather getting tired. I thought, he doesn't want us to find this pastry place, but why not? I wanted to give grandfather a warning and nudge, but I didn't have to. He wasn't a sharp city person like Cousin Wandu, but he wasn't an easy one to fool either, as I knew all too well. Very good of you, my boy, he said, nodding as if he was pleased. But you will be wanting to get off to work, I expect. We'll look forward to seeing you later. Come along, Solomon, or are you planning to sit there stuffing your face all day? Cousin Wandu looked desperately at Cousin Meseret and said, but it'll be awful out there in town today. The Olympic athletes are landing at the airport this morning and the streets will be packed. There's going to be a procession of triumph through the whole city. You'll never be able to get anywhere. Cousin Wandu leaped on this. She's right. Honestly, Uncle, we'll be worried about you if you go out today. I could have told him to save his breath. Nothing stops grandfather doing what he wants to do. And for once, I was glad of it. A procession of triumph. I might get to see it, to see them. And if I did, everyone in Kidami would just about die of envy. We were out in the street soon after that. Cousin Wandu was still protesting, even as we went out through the door. But grandfather just ignored him. My feet were still sore from the day before, and my legs ached too. But I forgot about them as soon as we got out of Cousin Wandu's side street onto the main road. I was busy looking around at everything, and the cars and the buildings and the people. I was confused by all the noises too. The blaring horns and rumbling trucks and shouting people. Cousin Wandu had been right. The streets were much more crowded than they'd been the day before. Everyone was waiting for the procession to come past. Suddenly I realized that I'd lost grandfather. For a moment I was too frozen with fright to move. And then the gang of schoolgirls in front of me parted, and I caught sight of his gray head walking along in his calm, unhurried way. I ran to catch up with him and felt a babyish urge to hold on to his hand. But, of course, I didn't. Where are we going, grandfather? I asked. How are we going to find this place? He didn't like questions, so I might have saved myself the bother of asking, because I know all the time that he wouldn't answer. Instead, he headed over towards a little shop. Not one of the smart ones was big glass windows, but a little one that looked as if it had wandered into the city from the country like us. An old man was sitting on a bench outside it, enjoying the warmth of the morning sun. Grandfather went up to him and coughed politely to attract his attention. The old man looked up. It took a long time, of course. It always does when old men get together. All the greetings and introductions and explanations, they never seemed to stop. When grandfather sat down on the bench beside the old man, and they got started on the state of the roads in Addis Ababa, I thought we'd be there all day. Grandfather got to the point at last. The happiness pastry? The old man said, holding grandfather's crumpled, bit of paper close up to his eyes. Yes, I know where that is. Not far from here at all. I'll get my nephew to show you the way. He twisted around to call back in through the open door of the shop. Kibide, where is that dratted boy? Come here. A boy came out. He looked about my age. Show this gentleman the way to the happiness pastry, the old man ordered, then came straight back here. Yes, uncle, the boy said, but when he saw me looking at him, he gave me a sly grin. I almost laughed out loud. He'd be off on a nice little expedition of his own once he'd shown us the way. I was sure of it. I thought I'd feel shy with a smart city boy like Kibide, who was wearing shoes and new-looking shorts, but he was so friendly that I liked him at once. Is this the way they'll come? The athletes, I asked him. Sure, he said. What do you think everyone's waiting for? I still couldn't believe that I was actually going to see them. There are two, Tulu and Haile Gebrselassie, had been my heroes ever since I could remember. They seemed supernatural to me, not like real people at all. I'd never imagined in my wildest dreams that I might actually ever see them in real life. Here you are, Kibide said suddenly, the happiness pastry. His uncle had been right. It had taken hardly any time at all to find it. Good lad, said grandfather. He fished out a coin from his pocket and gave it to Kibide. Get back to your shop now. With a polite thank you and a wink at me, Kibide had gone. I looked above the doorway of the pastry shop. A large sign said happiness. It could be seen from away down the street, in both directions. Cousin Wandu must know this place, I said to myself. I wonder what he's up to. Chapter 5. I'd been excited at the thought of the pastry shop. There's no such thing in Kidemi, but I knew about sweet cakes because Marcos's uncle had brought some when he'd come to visit his family. Marcos said he'd never eaten anything like those cakes in his whole life. He said they stuck to his teeth, but in a nice way. I wasn't silly enough to expect grandfather to buy me one, of course, but I suppose there was a lurking hope at the back of my mind. As it was, I didn't even have time to take a proper look in through the door. All I got was a glimpse of a shiny floor, some metal chairs and tables and glass, counter with piles of yellow, brown, and white cakes on shelves underneath. It wasn't the happiness pastry shop that grandfather wanted to visit, after all, but the building beside it. This was high, with shops on the ground floor and 4 stories above. Grandfather pushed open a door at the side and began to walk slowly up the staircase. When the door clanged shut behind us, I'll admit right now that my nerves were tingling. I'd never been in a place like this before. As a matter of fact, I wasn't exactly used to stairs. In Kidemi, even our school is all on one floor. I followed grandfather up step by step, going as slowly as he did. On every landing there were doors, off to the left and the right, and grandfather stopped, gasping for breath, pointing to the plaques on them to make me read them out to him. They were all in English, and he's better at reading Amharic. Blue Nile Insurance, I spelled out. Gion Export, Lion Trading. Every time, grandfather shook his head, sighed, and plodded on upward. At last, we came to a door that just said Ethiopian Sports Company. And when I'd read it out to him, grandfather gave a grunt of triumph that turned into a cough. I can tell you, if you're interested, that we'd climbed 69 steps. I looked around and saw that he was holding on to the banister, and his face had that gray look on it again. There was nothing I could do, so I just waited until he had stopped panting. Is this grandfather? Are you all right? Is this it, grandfather? Are you all right? He didn't answer, but he reached out from my shoulder and, leaning on me, walked the few steps to the door. It opened just before we reached it, and a smart young woman in a red dress came reaching out. A handbag swinging from her shoulder. A handbag swinging from her shoulder. She clattered off down the stairs in her high-heeled shoes. Even though she'd barely glanced at me, she'd made me feel like a worm. I was horribly conscious of my bare feet and crumpled shirt and stained old shorts. I think that, just for once, grandfather must have guessed how I was feeling, because he squeezed my elbow and said, "City girls, eh, Solomon? They all think they're the Queen of Sheba." Then he squared his shoulders and marched me into the office. It took a while for him to explain himself, and we had put up with quite a few stares and raised eyebrows from the 5 people sitting behind desks, who were reading piles of paper, or clattering away on keyboards, or staring into screens, or talking on telephones. It was then that I had heard Atto Elimu's name for the first time. At last, though, they waved us towards a bench at the side of the room. I still hadn't got an idea of what grandfather wanted, or why we'd come to this place, or why we'd come to this place. And as we sat and waited on and off, I started to wonder if grandfather had any idea either. Old people did get mixed up about things sometimes, I knew. Perhaps we'd come all this way to Adidas for some crazy reason after all. I should have had more faith in my wily old grandfather, because at last a door at the end of the room opened and a man came out. He looked at us without smiling. He seemed a bit cautious, as if he was afraid we'd turn out to be a nuisance. He was about the age as Abba and cousin Juan do. I know that now, but he looked much younger, and he couldn't have been more different. He was wearing a brilliant white shirt and a blue tie, and his shoes were shiny with polish. His hands were smooth, not a bit like Abba's powerful, rough working hands, and he had a big gold ring on one finger. I could see a silver-colored watch, too, poking out from beneath his shirt sleeve. "So you're Atto Dimisi, are you?" he said, frowning. He looked down at me. "Did this boy bring you here?" "You can go now, son." And he started feeling in his pocket for a coin. Grandfather was still struggling to get up from the bench, and the effort was making him mutter irritably. "This is my grandson Solomon," he wheezed out. "Are you really Alumu, Petro's son?" The man's frown deepened. He nodded curtly. "You'd better come into my office." He led us across the room, with the eyes of all the people behind their desk following us curiously, and in through the door of his office, which he closed behind us. Thank you, everybody, and be seeing you for Chapter 6.